Now we need to learn about an important concept, which is DbContext in Entity Framework Core. DbContext class is an integral part of Entity Framework. An instance of DbContext represents a session with the database which can be used to query and save instances of your entities to a database. DbContext is a combination of unit of work and repository pattern. If those does not sound familiar, do not worry, we will understand them as we proceed with the course. DbContext in EF Core allows us to perform multiple tasks. It helps us to manage the database connection, configure model and relationship, query the database, save data to the database, configure changing or tracking the data, caching, and also transaction management. To use DbContext in our application, we need to create that class that derives from the existing DbContext class in our entity framework. This context class typically contains dbSet for each entity or model. We will understand all of that. So the first thing that we need is we need a connection. So in simple words, we need something that will connect us from our application to our database, and that binding is provided by the DbContext class. So how can we create a DbContext class? For that, let me switch back to the application, and we have our app settings where we added the connection string. What we want to focus on right now is to add a DbContext so that we can add a connection between our application and the database. So we'll go to Solution Explorer and let me add that inside the Data Access project. We have the data folder here. I'll right click here and I'll add a new class file. You can call this anything you want, but typically we want to add a DbContext there so that it sounds familiar. So I'm going to call it application DbContext and we will add this file. First thing that you need to realize is always make sure to make the class file as public. And next thing is, how do you identify this as a DbContext? It is simple. It should extend the DbContext class. We'll do control dot and you can see this class is inside Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. Once you do that, then this becomes the DbContext for your project. Next thing that we have to do is we need a constructor here. So I'll use the snippet CTOR with .NET Core, and here in the constructor it expects an options object for the DbContext options. So we'll have to use the DbContext options, and we need the class name, which is application DbContext. We'll call this as options, and we have to pass this to the base class of the DbContext. So we'll pass our options to the base class. This is one of the requirements that comes with setting up the DbContext in your project. But in the constructor, you do not have to do anything. You're just passing this DbContext options to the DbContext class. With this, we have added the DbContext in our project. Now this DbContext will be responsible for creating a binding between the application and the SQL Server. And you might be thinking where we will create that binding. That binding we will do inside startup.cs class file of the Wizlib web project. So if we click here, we have the configure services. You can see this method gets called by the runtime. We use this method to add services to our container. We want to add the DbContext to our services. So we will say services.addDbContext. And in here we need a class. So the context class name is application DbContext. And we have to pass the options here. So we will configure the options. The option that we need to configure is what is the data provider. So we'll say options. We will be using SQL Server we have already installed the package, because of which it shows us the option, and inside the parameter here, we need to pass the connection string. Now getting the connection string from app settings is easy, and we will do that using dependency injection. Let me just put this in a new line. And in here, we will be using configuration dot. We have the get connection string here. And in there, when we define the connection string in app settings, make sure that this is the exact name. It cannot be something else. It needs to be connection strings. Also, it will be case sensitive. In that, we have the default connection. So we will copy this default connection, go back to our startup, and inside the get connection strings, all we have to do is paste that default connection. What that will do is it will fetch that connection string, pass it to our DbContext, and while it adds the services to the container, it will configure the connection and everything will work as expected. So these are the few steps that you had to do to add DbContext to your project. You can think of this as basic configuration steps that any application needs to set up a database. Once you have set this, now you will see the real power of EF Core. Let's start exploring that by building our first model in the next video.